There is a moment that almost no one can explain, an instant in which someone who claimed to love deeply transforms into a cold, calculating, and almost unrecognizable presence. There are no sincere tears, there is no mourning, there is no true farewell, just an abrupt change, as if an invisible mask had fallen before his eyes. Most people call it cruelty, others say it's revenge, but Carl Jung would see something much deeper. He would say that, at that very moment, we are not witnessing the end of a relationship. We are witnessing the collapse of an entire structure of the psyche. What actually happens when an empath abandons a narcissist? Why can a simple no, a finally established limit, or a silent decision to leave provoke such an intense, disproportionate, and often destructive reaction? If you believe that all of this happens just because the narcissist has lost someone they loved, prepare to abandon this idea. Today we will cross a territory where emotions are no longer just feelings and start to reveal invisible mechanisms of the human soul. Imagine that Carl Jung stands in front of an ancient stone door. He doesn't open it right away. First, he turns his gaze to you and says that every great human tragedy begins when we mistake the mask for the true face. Then, in silence, he slowly pushes that door. On the other hand, there is not only the story of a narcissist and an empath, there is an archetypal theater that crosses centuries, cultures, and generations, repeating itself whenever a consciousness remains imprisoned by the illusion of who it believes it is. According to Jung, each human being builds a persona. It is necessary. It is the face we show to the world, the role we play in society, the family, and the people we meet throughout life. For a healthy personality, this mask is just a tool. It can be used and taken off without the essence disappearing. But there's a silent danger. When someone comes to believe that the persona is all there is, they stop living as a human being and start living as a character. At that moment, an invisible prison is born. It is exactly at this point that the real tragedy of the narcissist begins. Its grandeur is not a fortress. It is a delicate construction, supported by looks, compliments, admiration, and constant validation. The glow that seems to come from within actually depends on the light reflected by others. Their identity is no longer born from their own consciousness and starts to depend on what the world returns as a reflection. What looks like absolute self-confidence is often a deeply hidden dependency. But every structure built on reflections needs a mirror. And this is where empath comes in. Carl Jung might say that the empath does not enter this story by chance. He is attracted by the possibility of seeing potential where everyone sees defects. Your sensitivity perceives invisible pains. His compassion seeks to restore that which seems broken. Your ability to understand the suffering of others becomes an extraordinary strength. However, when this force finds no conscious limits, it can become the perfect path for manipulation. Empath doesn't just offer attention, it offers presence. It doesn't just deliver affection, it delivers psychic energy. And, without realizing it, he begins to feed a persona that desperately needs to continue existing. While you believe you are saving someone, you may be strengthening precisely the structure that prevents that person from looking inside yourself. Realize the depth of this paradox. The narcissist believes that he has found someone who finally recognizes his supposed greatness. The empath believes that he has found someone whose soul can be restored by love. Both live an intense experience. Both feel true emotions, but both are looking at projected images, not reality. Jung called this phenomenon projection. We don't just see who is in front of us. We see what our unconscious wants to find. That's why this encounter often feels magical. It all seems to make sense. Conversations flow naturally. There is an almost mystical sense of fate, as if two souls have finally recognized each other. However, depth psychology alerts us to an uncomfortable truth. The more perfect a relationship seems at the beginning, the greater the number of unconscious projections supporting that experience. The symbolic tradition teaches that every intense light produces an equally deep shadow. Jung did not see the shadow as an enemy, but as everything we refuse to know in ourselves. It remains silent as long as the persona manages to maintain control. However, no mask can remain intact forever. Every illusion requires energy to continue existing. And there comes a time when even the most dedicated mirror begins to tire of reflecting an image that it no longer recognizes as true. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Perhaps he felt that no matter how much love, understanding, and patience he offered, nothing seemed enough. Perhaps he believed that it was enough to love a little more for everything to finally change. But Jung would ask a question that few have the courage to face. What if the problem had never been the amount of love offered? What if the real conflict was in the invisible function that each one started to play within this relationship? This is exactly where our journey begins. We have not yet seen the fall of the mask. We have not yet heard the silence that precedes the storm. We have not yet found the shadow that awaits in the depths of the unconscious. All we have seen so far is the careful construction of a theater where each character believes he knows his role. But there is an inevitable instant in every work of the soul, the moment when one of the actors decides to leave the stage. And when that happens, Carl Jung warns us that it's not just a relationship that collapses. It is the very architecture of illusion that begins to crumble. Every great transformation begins almost imperceptibly. It's not an explosion. It is not a definitive discussion. It's not a door slamming. It's a different silence, a look that no longer seeks approval, a message that takes longer to be answered, a request that finally receives a no. To those who observe from the outside, nothing seems extraordinary. But deep in the psyche, an earthquake has just begun. Carl Jung would say that this is the moment when consciousness ceases to serve illusion and begins, albeit timidly, to walk towards truth itself. The empath rarely abandons someone on impulse. Before leaving, he tries to understand. Then he tries to justify it. Then he seeks to relieve the pain of the other, even when his own soul is already deeply wounded. He endures words he should never hear, accepts behaviors he would never accept from anyone else, and believes for a long time that one more gesture of understanding will be enough to awaken the good part of the one he loves. This, apparently noble hope, becomes an invisible current. Maybe you recognize this scene. A conversation ends with you apologizing for something you didn't even cause. You spend hours trying to explain your feelings, while the other person turns every word into an accusation against you. Days later, he promises himself that he will not allow it again. However, when the decisive moment arrives, it backtracks. Not because you are weak, but because your compassion keeps looking for a reason to stay. Carl Jung would see in this one of the deepest conflicts of the human soul, the difficulty of abandoning an image that the unconscious itself helped to build. Meanwhile, the narcissist notices changes much earlier than he demonstrates. He feels that something is slipping out of his control, not necessarily because Empath has announced his departure, but because the energy of the relationship has begun to change. The gaze ceased to reflect unconditional admiration. The answers no longer feed the greatness of the persona. Small limits begin to emerge, and what seems insignificant to any healthy relationship represents, to a structure based on constant validation, a silent threat. It is curious how this moment usually goes unnoticed, even by Empath himself. He believes he's just trying to breathe a little. He decides to spend an afternoon alone without feeling guilty, refuse an unfair request. He stops interrupting his own commitments to solve problems that never belong to him. For the first time in a long time, he chooses to take care of his own peace before putting out someone else's emotional fire. These are simple, almost banal attitudes. However, according to Carl Jung's view, they are deeply symbolic movements. Each limit established represents a small step in the direction of individuation, the path of return to the true self. It is precisely at this point that the narrative takes an unexpected turn. The empath believes he is just reorganizing his life. The narcissist, however, interprets these same events as the beginning of a catastrophe, not because he is losing a company, but because his persona begins to lose the mirror that supported his existence. Jung said that what we repress never disappears. It remains alive in the deepest regions of the unconscious, waiting for the moment when the defenses weaken. And now, these defenses are beginning to show cracks. Imagine an ancient castle built on pillars eroded by time. For years, its facade remains imposing. Those who pass by believe that that construction is solid and unshakable, but it is enough to remove a single support column for small cracks to appear in the walls. The building remains standing for a few moments. However, his fall has already become inevitable. This is how persona works when it depends completely on external approval. She seems powerful until the mirror decides not to reflect anymore. In everyday life, this takes surprisingly common forms. Empath stops arguing because he realizes that no explanation changes reality. He fails to respond immediately to provocations. He no longer feels the need to convince anyone of his intentions. Silence, which was impossible before, becomes his greatest protection. Curiously, the more serene he becomes, the more intense the other's restlessness seems. This inversion confuses those who have never lived this experience. After all, wasn't it precisely the peace they both claim to seek? Carl Jung might answer that not all peace is of interest to the unconscious. There are psychological structures that survive precisely from conflict. While the empath tries to solve problems, they remain emotionally connected. While trying to prove his love, he continues to offer energy. While insisting on restoring the relationship, he keeps the illusion of the persona alive. But when you choose conscious silence, something completely different happens. The invisible flow that fed that system begins to disappear. It is then that a strange sensation invades the environment. It's not just tension. It is as if a hidden presence is slowly awakening. Small attitudes become unexpectedly dramatic. A simple, canceled appointment generates disproportionate accusations. A healthy limit is treated as betrayal. The empath begins to ask himself, why does such a simple decision provoke such an intense reaction? This question marks the beginning of a profound change. For the first time, he stops looking only for answers in the behavior of the other and begins to observe the invisible dynamics that have always sustained the relationship. In Jung's symbolic perspective, this is the moment when the light of consciousness reaches regions that have remained hidden for a long time. But every light casts shadows. The more the empath awakens to their own reality, the more the narcissist's shadow comes closer to the surface. She has not yet fully revealed herself. It remains hidden behind seemingly familiar gestures, sudden promises, changes that seem sincere, and carefully chosen words to restore the old balance. To those who observe superficially, it may even seem that everything is finally getting better. However, there is one detail that Carl Jung would never ignore. True transformation never happens because someone fears losing control. It is only born when there is courage to face the shadow itself. And this is exactly the path that the narcissist still refuses to take. As the empath begins, without even realizing it, its journey towards the self, something very different awakens on the other side. It is not regret. It is not renewed love. It is an ancient, repressed, deeply instinctive force that finally finds a gap to emerge. And when that force takes full command, the mask will no longer hide what has been hidden since the first encounter. I will prepare this part as a direct continuation of parts 1 and 2, keeping Carl Jung as the central presence. But I cannot help writing as if they were Jung's real ideas or teachings when the content extrapolates or attributes to him statements that he did not make. I can, however, create a narrative clearly inspired by his concepts: persona, shadow, projection, and individuation, distinguishing the dramatization from the author's work. When the persona begins to lose its strength, something curious happens. The change is not usually noticed first by the empath, but by the psychological system that supported the relationship. It's like an old machine that worked for years because all the gears obeyed the same movement. It was enough for one of them to slow down for the entire mechanism to start emitting noises that were previously invisible. The narcissist still smiles. He still promises changes. He still tries to convince the other that everything can go back to the way it was before. But behind that surface, a silent battle has already begun. Inspired by Carl Jung's vision, we can imagine that the persona desperately struggles to remain intact while the shadow moves ever closer to the light. The empath rarely realizes that his greatest transformation does not happen when he decides to leave, but when he fails to react in the expected way. For a long time, each criticism was answered with justifications. Each accusation aroused guilt. Each silence generated anxiety. Now, however, something different emerges. It's not coldness. It is not revenge. It is a serenity that is born when the consciousness begins to recover the territory it had given to the expectations of the other. This movement seems small, but it has enormous symbolic significance. For the first time, the center of life ceases to be in the approval of others and slowly returns inward. It is precisely at this moment that the narcissist feels a discomfort that is difficult to explain. Not because he lost an argument, but because the invisible logic that organized that relationship stopped working. What once produced predictability now produces uncertainty. The mirror no longer returns the expected image. The stage is still set, but the script is no longer followed. And when one character breaks the script, all the others have to improvise. But why does a simple change in posture provoke such an intense reaction? Why does someone who seemed so sure of himself demonstrate such a lack of control in the face of a healthy limit? Perhaps the answer lies not in the strength of the one who tries to control, but in the fragility of what he tries to protect. Inspired by Jung's thought, we can understand this phase as an inevitable encounter between consciousness and everything that has remained hidden for years. The shadow is not born at this moment. It was always present. It just stopped remaining invisible. While persona received constant confirmation, there was little room for repressed content to emerge. However, when validation wanes, old insecurities begin to slowly rise to the surface, like forgotten objects at the bottom of a lake that becomes increasingly transparent. That is why many reactions seem contradictory. In one day, emotional declarations, promises of a new beginning, and intense demonstrations of affection appear. In the other, accusations, contempt, and an unexpected coldness appear. To those who observe from the outside, it seems incoherent. However, from a symbolic perspective, it is a desperate attempt to restore a structure that is losing stability. The persona tries to regain space, while the shadow insists on revealing what has been hidden for so long. There is an old image from the alchemical tradition that helps to understand this process. Before any precious metal reveals its purity, it must go through the fire. Heat does not create impurities. It only makes visible what was already mixed with matter from the beginning. The same happens with certain human relationships. Crisis does not necessarily create the deepest conflicts. It illuminates that which remained hidden while everything seemed to work. What if the biggest fear had never been losing the empath? What if the real fear was to lose the story that the narcissist has built about himself? When this possibility arises, does he fight for the relationship or for the survival of the image he has learned to defend? There is a detail that usually goes unnoticed. Empath believes that he is facing only one other person. However, in many moments, he feels as if he is talking to completely different versions of the same individual. In a few hours, he finds someone charming, sensitive, and apparently willing to understand. In others, he finds a cold, distant presence that is unable to recognize any responsibility. This alternation produces enormous emotional confusion. The mind seeks to unite these two images into a single, logical explanation. The more you try, the more exhausted you become. Inspired by Jung, we can look at this experience in another way. Perhaps the big trap is not in finding out which of these versions is the true one. Perhaps the mistake is to believe that the essence of someone can be understood only by the words they utter in moments of tranquility. The true psychological structure usually reveals itself precisely when it loses control of circumstances. It is during the crisis that masks become more difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, something equally important happens within Empath. For the first time, he begins to suspect his own need to remain understanding everything. A silent question arises that previously seemed impossible. What if I don't need to solve what belongs to the other? This simple reflection completely alters the direction of psychic energy. Instead of continuing to feed a cycle of endless explanations, consciousness begins to turn inward. This movement marks the beginning of a transformation that goes far beyond the end of a relationship. It is the beginning of the reconstruction of an identity that had been slowly dissolved. Still, the most delicate moment is yet to come, because every control-based structure reacts when it realizes that its influence is waning. Before accepting the loss, she usually intensifies her own mechanisms. Carefully chosen words, idealized memories, convincing promises, and even unexpected displays of vulnerability can emerge as a last attempt to restore the old balance. At first glance, they seem to be signs of change. In depth, they may represent only an effort to prevent the cycle from actually ending. What happens when these strategies stop working? What is left when neither charm nor guilt nor confusion can make the empath return to the role he played for so long? It is exactly at this point that the narrative reaches its deepest region, because the next step will not only show the reaction of a narcissist in the face of loss, It will reveal the invisible architecture that underpins this behavior and explain why some people would rather face a war against the entire world than stare for a single moment at the shadow itself. There is an ancient symbol present in several spiritual traditions: the labyrinth. Unlike a common path, it was not created to confuse those who enter, but to reveal who we really are when we believe we are lost. Inspired by Carl Jung's vision, we can imagine that the relationship between the narcissist and the empath works exactly this way. For a long time, both walk through the same corridors believing they are moving in the direction of love. However, when the empath stops feeding the persona, he realizes that he has never been on a shared road. He walked inside someone else's psychological labyrinth. And now, for the first time, he begins to see the walls that have always been around him. It is at this point that many events considered inexplicable start to make sense. There are surprising reports from people who claim that their partner seemed to completely change their personality in a matter of minutes. One morning, he showed affection, made plans for the future, and talked about building a life together. A few hours later, he would treat the same person as if he were a stranger, hurling cold accusations or acting with a contempt that seemed impossible to imagine. For those who live this experience, the feeling is disturbing. It seems that there are two people inhabiting the same body. Inspired by Jung's analytical psychology, we can understand this impression as the clash between the carefully constructed persona and repressed contents that begin to slip away when the stability of the mask is threatened. Interestingly, the more the empath tries to find an emotional rationale for these changes, the further away it is from the answer. He looks for a recent reason, a misplaced word, an inappropriate gesture, or some mistake made without realizing it. However, the true origin of this conflict is often much older. She was born long before that relationship existed. Empath entered a story whose structure was already ready. It just occupied a place that needed to be filled. This detail produces an uncomfortable revelation. Perhaps the narcissist was never trying to preserve just that specific relationship. Perhaps he was defending his own narrative about who he believed himself to be. When someone spends years sustaining an identity based solely on admiration for others, and any threat to reflection becomes a threat to one's own sense of existence. It's not just about losing a partner. It is a question of facing the risk of discovering that the image built for so long does not have the solid foundations it seemed to have. There is a symbolic curiosity often remembered by scholars of Jung's work. In many mythological narratives, the hero never faces the largest monster at the beginning of the journey. First, he crosses dark corridors, solves riddles, and encounters seemingly contradictory figures. Only later does he realize that all these encounters prepared his consciousness to look at what really needed to be seen. Something similar happens here. The narcissist believes that he fights against abandonment. The empath believes that he fights to preserve love. But, in depth, both are facing something much bigger: the inevitable confrontation with what they have remained to avoid within themselves. In everyday life, this appears in extremely common situations. The empath decides not to respond immediately to a provocation. Instead of justifying his position, he remains silent. Hours later, he receives dozens of messages alternating affection, guilt, promises, and accusations. The next day, the narcissist acts as if nothing has happened. To those who observe from the outside, it seems only emotional instability. For those who live this reality, a devastating confusion sets in. After all, which of these versions represents the truth? Inspired by Jung's symbolic reading, perhaps the correct question is another. Why is there such a need to prevent silence from remaining? Another impressive aspect arises when we observe the behavior after the loss of control. Many people report that old moments of vulnerability, confidences, and fears shared in moments of deep intimacy are now used as instruments of pressure. What seemed to have been received with understanding suddenly turns into an argument to hurt. This phenomenon has a huge impact because it breaks a fundamental expectation of human relationships, that intimacy creates protection. When this does not happen, the feeling of betrayal is profound. Inspired by the Jungian idea of projection, we can reflect on this behavior without reducing it to a simple, conscious choice. When the shadow remains rejected, it becomes common to displace feelings that one's own conscience cannot bear. Constant criticism, devaluation, and even the attempt to reverse responsibilities can work as ways to remove painful content from oneself. They do not delete this content. They only temporarily change their destiny. But there is an even more unexpected event. In several accounts, the moment when the empath finally stops reacting emotionally causes a greater uneasiness than all previous discussions. This seems contradictory. For months or years, there were intense conflicts, apologies, endless explanations, and attempts at reconciliation. None of this significantly altered the dynamics of the relationship. So, why does silence produce such an impact? Because conscious silence interrupts the flow that kept that system running. It stops feeding the expectation of control and forces the entire structure to face a void for which it was never prepared. Carl Jung used to show that what we avoid returns in ever more intense forms. The more a part of the psyche is kept away from consciousness, the greater its strength tends to be when it finally finds an opening to emerge. It is like a spring dammed up for years. As long as the dam remains intact, everything seems peaceful. However, it only takes a small crack for the accumulated pressure to reveal its true intensity. The empath only observes external reactions. What he does not see is the enormous psychological tension that lies behind the desperate attempt to restore an identity built on reflexes. At this moment, something equally important happens on the other side of the story. The empath begins to notice details that he previously ignored. He realizes that he was always the one who initiated the reconciliations. He discovers that he often abandoned his own projects to solve recurring crises. He recalls conversations in which he left convinced he was wrong without being able to explain exactly why. These memories do not arise to feed resentment. They appear because consciousness is reorganizing its own narrative. It is as if pieces, scattered over years, finally began to form a single image. However, the biggest mystery still remains hidden. If the persona really is losing its strength and the shadow insists on emerging, why do some people seem unable to go through this process and transform themselves? What prevents this collapse from becoming an opportunity for growth? Inspired by Carl Jung, we are about to reach the most decisive point of this entire journey. Because the answer is not only in the structure of the narcissist or in the sensitivity of the empath, it is in the inevitable encounter between consciousness and the only reality that no mask can hide forever, the truth that inhabits the shadow itself. There is an instant in every great crossing when it is no longer possible to return to the starting point. Inspired by Carl Jung's vision, we have arrived at exactly this moment. Empath has already begun to see the theater that for so long he confused with reality. The narcissist realizes that the old dynamic is slipping out of his hands. The distance between the two is no longer just physical or emotional. It became psychological. One slowly awakens to one's own consciousness. The other desperately tries to preserve the structure that has sustained its identity for years. And it is precisely when these two movements intersect that the tension reaches its highest point. The most surprising thing is that many times the last attempt to prevent this rupture does not happen through aggressiveness, but through charm. After weeks of accusations, criticism, and conflict, the narcissist can reappear exactly as it was at the beginning of the relationship. The voice is sweet again. The promises seem sincere. Plans for the future are reborn. There are apologies, emotional declarations, and gestures that make the empath think, maybe now he really understands everything. It is at this moment that many stories start again, only to repeat the same cycle. Carl Jung invites us to look beyond appearance. Inspired by their understanding of the psyche, we can imagine that the persona makes its last great effort to stay alive, not because he has found a deeper truth, but because he feels that his old way of existing is threatened. When an identity has been built on the constant need for validation, losing this source can cause an intense restoration movement. For those who live in the situation, distinguishing a true transformation from an attempt to regain the old balance becomes extremely difficult. Perhaps you have heard similar reports. People who claim that just when they decided to leave, they received demonstrations of affection that they had never experienced before. Unexpected gifts, messages during the night, promises of definitive change. Some even say that it was the most affectionate period of their entire relationship. The inevitable question almost always arises in the same way. Why did all this only happen when I left? The answer is not usually simple, but this question marks one of the most delicate moments of the entire journey. If the empath believes that he has finally found the person he has always been waiting for, he can return exactly to the place he tried to leave. However, if you observe events with a broader awareness, you will begin to notice an important detail. Profound changes are not sustained only by intense words. They transform behaviors consistently over time. It is precisely this difference that emotion often prevents us from perceiving. But there is an even more unexpected twist. When the charm ceases to have an effect, a new strategy can emerge almost without warning. That same person who said they couldn't live without you starts to act as if your absence didn't matter. Silence replaces promises. An apparent indifference arises. In some cases, a new relationship appears surprisingly quickly. For Empath, this experience is usually devastating. How can someone who claimed to love so deeply move forward in such a short time? Inspired by Jung's reflection, we can interpret this speed differently from what suffering usually suggests. The appearance of another person does not necessarily prove that the previous bond was insignificant, nor does it demonstrate that the narcissist has found ultimate happiness. It may reveal, rather, the urgent need to restore a psychological structure that continues to depend on new reflexes to remain standing. The mirror changes, the need remains. This understanding profoundly changes the way Empath sees its own history. For a long time, he believed that he had lost a contest against someone better, more interesting, or more capable. Gradually, he begins to realize that he has never participated in a competition. The place he occupied was not defined by who he was as a person, but by the function he exercised within that system. This discovery hurts because it destroys a carefully constructed illusion. At the same time, it makes room for a freedom that previously seemed impossible. Carl Jung stated that no process of individuation happens without the encounter with the shadow itself. And perhaps this is the most difficult challenge for Empath. It is not enough to understand the mechanisms of the narcissist. You have to ask honestly, why did I stay so long trying to save someone who didn't want to look at himself? This question does not seek to produce guilt. It returns responsibility. And there is a huge difference between these two experiences. Guilt paralyzes. Responsibility transforms. When this reflection matures, old memories take on new meaning. The empath recalls situations in which he ignored his own intuition. He remembers the first small inconsistencies he chose to justify. He realizes how many times he has confused suffering with emotional depth. Gradually, he understands that his greatest strength, the ability to understand the other, became dangerous when he stopped including himself. The compassion that enlightened so many people had left his own conscience in the shadows. It is precisely at this point that the real twist of the narrative happens. Until now, it seemed that the whole story revolved around the narcissist. However, slowly, the focus changes direction. The main character was never the one who manipulated. He was always the one who needed to discover his own worth without depending on anyone's approval. The center of the journey is no longer the loss of the relationship and becomes the birth of a more conscious identity. Still, there is one last hurdle. Even after understanding all this dynamic, Empath continues to live with difficult questions. What if it really changes? What if I'm quitting too soon? What if it's my fault? These doubts do not mean weakness. They are part of the process of abandoning a reality built over a long time. No psychological prison disappears just because the door has been opened. It is necessary to believe that there is life on the outside. It is exactly at this moment that Carl Jung seems to lead his gaze to a broader horizon. Inspired by his vision, we realize that every deep crisis offers two possibilities. One of them is to reconstruct the same mask, making it even more rigid. The other is to accept that certain illusions must die in order for something true to be born. The narcissist and the empath arrive at the same intersection, but choose completely different paths. One continues to look for new mirrors to confirm an image he fears losing. The other begins, for the first time, to search within himself for that which will never depend on anyone's gaze. And it is this silent choice that will prepare the most important outcome of the entire story, when we will discover that the greatest victory was never to abandon someone, but to finally leave behind the version of oneself that one believed needed to live, only to reflect the life of the other. Here is the conclusion of the script, maintaining the continuity of the 5 previous parts and based on the structure and concepts presented in the source text. Without attributing to Carl Jung, specific statements that are not in his work. We have reached the point where every mask loses its usefulness. After traversing the halls of the persona, observing the rise of the shadow, understanding the power of the projection, and following the slow rebuilding of the empath, only one question remains. What does it really mean to beat this story? For a long time, you may have believed that the answer would be to see the narcissist acknowledge their mistakes, ask for forgiveness, or finally change. But, inspired by Carl Jung's vision, we realize that true victory never depends on the transformation of the other. It starts when you stop giving someone the power to define who you are. There is a very old image that appears in different spiritual traditions. It tells of a person who walks through a dark forest all night. As she walks, she believes that the darkness is trying to destroy her. Only at dawn does he realize that the forest has never been his enemy. It only forced her to develop senses that she would never have discovered in the light of day. So it is with certain experiences in life. Some relationships seem to be born to offer us happiness, but they end up offering something even more valuable: awareness. Maybe today you can look back and recognize signs that once seemed invisible. Conversations in which his feelings were diminished, boundaries that you have abandoned to avoid conflicts, moments when his intuition tried to warn him but was silenced by the hope that everything would get better. These memories can cause pain. However, they can also be transformed into wisdom. The difference is in the way you choose to carry them from now on. Carl Jung understood individuation as a path of integration. It does not mean becoming perfect. It means to become whole. It means moving from living just to live up to external expectations and starting to build an identity that stands firm, even when no one is looking. That's why Empath's biggest change doesn't happen on the day he leaves. It happens the day you stop looking for your own importance in the reflection produced by someone else. This process does not happen all at once. There are days when doubt returns. There are times when nostalgia tries to convince you that it was all a big misunderstanding. At other times, guilt reappears with unexpected force. At these times, it is worth remembering a simple question: am I missing the person or the hope that they would one day become who I imagine? Often the answer reveals that the greatest attachment was never to the relationship, but to the promise of a future that existed only in the imagination. It is precisely there that a silent freedom is born. You realize that you no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. You don't need to justify every limit you set. You don't need to turn understanding into self-sacrifice. You discover that saying no can also be a gesture of love, especially when that love finally includes you. This is perhaps one of the greatest lessons inspired by analytical psychology. True compassion does not require the abandonment of one's own conscience, but understanding all this intellectually is not enough. Transformation happens in the small choices made every day. When someone crosses an important boundary, observe their reaction before trying to please. When you feel guilt about protecting your peace, ask yourself if that guilt was born of conscience or a habit of putting the needs of others above your own. When the urge arises to repeatedly explain what you've explained many times, pause. Not every person who listens is really willing to understand. Another powerful practice is to regain dialogue with your own reality. Write about what you feel. Record situations that arouse discomfort. Notice patterns that once seemed like isolated events. Writing organizes consciousness and prevents old distortions from redominating your perception. Likewise, preserve bonds with people who respect your boundaries, value your presence, and allow you to exist without having to play a role. Healthy relationships don't require you to disappear in order for the other to shine. It is also worth remembering that the shadow does not belong only to the narcissist. We all carry unknown aspects of our own personality. The goal is not to eliminate this part, but to know it. The more awareness we develop about our fears, our needs, and our patterns, the less likely we are to project these needs onto other people. True growth happens when we stop looking for a savior and start taking responsibility for our own journey. Perhaps the most profound lesson from this journey is this: the empath's sensitivity has never been his weakness. His difficulty lay in believing that to love meant to endure everything. Sensitivity remains an extraordinary force when it walks alongside discernment. Compassion is not submission. Forgiveness does not mean repeatedly accepting that which destroys your dignity. True love never requires you to abandon your identity. to preserve the image built by someone else. Meanwhile, the narcissist remains faced with a choice that belongs only to him. No genuine transformation can be imposed by those around them. Each person needs to decide whether they will have the courage to look at their own shadow or whether they will continue to invest all their energy in maintaining the persona. This decision is completely beyond Empath's control, and understanding this limit is perhaps one of the most profound forms of freedom. At the end of this story, there is no such thing as a winner and a loser in the ordinary sense of the word. There is someone who continues to look for mirrors to confirm a fragile identity, and someone who finally begins to build an identity that no longer depends on anyone's reflection. One remains attached to the old theater. The other discovers that true life begins when the curtains close and the performance ends. If this reflection has awakened something within you, allow that feeling not to end along with the video. Take these questions into your own life. Observe your relationships with more awareness. Value your limits. Trust your intuition when it points you to a path of peace. And most of all, remember that the greatest transformation happens when you choose to know yourself before trying to change anyone else. If this content made sense to you, leave your comment. If you prefer, you can comment anonymously or share just one word that represents your experience. Your participation can help others who are living the same journey in silence. Don't forget to like this video so that this message reaches more people, and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring topics about Carl Jung, persona, shadow, individuation, empaths, narcissists, and the mysteries of depth psychology. The next journey may reveal a part of you that is still waiting to be discovered.